Hi, this is Aaron Bean for BlueFirePoker.com, and today I'm starting off a new series on ICM, or the Independent Chip Model. What this is basically just a model for the changing value of tournament chips. And then ICM itself is a mathematical model, which means it's a formula for calculation. And a lot of people learn this model and they learn how to apply it to some specific calculations, mostly like pre-flop sort of calculations that they don't do while they're playing poker, but they can do before or after a session to sort of check whether they're playing well. And they learn this formula, and it's a very useful formula, and I do intend to teach it, but I think it can be kind of daunting at first and not necessarily as helpful as having some general concepts for how the value of tournament chips changes and how you can use that. So I've decided that I'm going to start off my series with just a few really general concepts, and I'm going to try to explain them really well, and then I'm going to talk about some of the more common situations in poker over the course of this series where you can use them and how to use them, what to do with them, and then maybe when we get into the more advanced, more difficult situations towards the end, we can start talking about this formula and some more numbers and stuff like that. So the most important concept for ICM is that in a poker tournament, the chips do not have a fixed cash value. What that means is that 25 chips in the same tournament might be at various times in the tournament worth totally different amounts of cash value to totally different players or whatever. And if you need evidence of this, like I have the easiest example. We're just considering, for the purpose of this concept and a lot of the concepts in this video, we're just considering like neutral break-even poker players that don't have a skill edge on their opponent, outside of the decisions they make with these concepts. But basically we're interested in this because it's just a way to simplify things. Obviously, your skill edge in poker will affect your decision in hands, but we're talking about a concept that has relatively small but important things about your play, and adjusting your play because of future expected value that you have as a winning player is even smaller than the adjustments that you'll be making because of ICM and this sort of consideration. So just to simplify things, I'm not going to worry about that right now. So here's my example. First hand of the Stars Million, let's say it just meets the guarantee, which is 5,000 players. If a player has 10,000 chips, obviously worth $200 at that stage in the tournament. But 10,000 chips clearly can be worth a lot more than $200, because if we consider this same break-even poker player, if he somehow miraculously made it heads up in the tournament, maybe he made it heads up with 10. He didn't make it heads up with 10,000, but he got down to 10,000 chips exactly while he was heads up, or something like that. His 10,000 chip stack would be worth, he'd be guaranteed second place, which is, again, assuming 5,000 players, like just at the guarantee, 140,000. And of course, he would still have a chance at winning the heads up. So clearly 10,000 chips are both worth 140,000 and 10,000. The difference, the caveat is that the context is important. What stage of the tournament you're at is largely what determines how much the chips you have are worth. And as we start talking about some of these concepts, you'll start to see why this is important and how you can use it, in case that's not important to you now. So not only do tournament chips have tournament chips, in addition to not having a fixed cash value, also have decreasing marginal value. Now, what we mean by decreasing marginal value, when poker players use that phrase, is that when your chip stack increases, each chip that you win is worth less than the previous one. Those are your marginal chips, that margin that you're adding on to your stack. And similarly, when your stack decreases, the margin is those few chips that you're losing. And so when your chip stack decreases, each chip that you lose is going to be worth more than the previous one. Basically, what this is saying is increasing your stack by 5% is worth some amount less than decreasing your stack by 5% hurts you. Now, when I say chips have decreasing marginal value in a poker tournament, that's almost always going to be technically correct, but it's often going to be negligible. What I mean by that is that, for example, in the first hand of the Stars Million or whatever, the chips you win are worth less than the chips that you lose, but it's by some tiny fractional amount that's insignificant. There may be worth 0.999%. The chips you win are of that compared to the chips you lose. It's not something that affects your decision, but it's a sort of a guiding principle of tournaments that still holds true in the most abstract way. So it's very important that you become convinced of this. Tournament chips have decreasing marginal value because it's sort of not only the foundation of this, but it's kind of the defining characteristic that separates tournament play from cash game play. The fact that if you do well, in a tournament, a few hours later you'll be at a final table or something like that, wouldn't otherwise necessarily make a big difference, but it's this idea that makes such a big difference. So if you aren't convinced of this, I kind of created what I hope is as simple an explanation as anyone could come up with for this. I try not to use too many numbers and formulas and stuff like that, but to some extent it's unavoidable. So I'm just going to dive right in, and even if you're familiar with this concept and you understand it, this argument will be very useful to learn for understanding other concepts in my series, and it's just a useful way to analyze it. So we're going to consider a tournament with equal stacks, perhaps on the first hand, perhaps players are maybe it's short-handed and they just happen to have very similar stacks. It doesn't really matter too much. We're just same as assuming the players are break even, which I didn't even write here, but we're also assuming that. We're just trying to simplify things so we can look at what really matters, which in this case we're looking at changes in their chips. So if we consider that our tournament has players A, B, C, D, etc., it doesn't really matter how many players for this example, but a lot of them, say. And if we say they all have equal equity because they all have equal stacks and they're all identical break-even whatever players, we're just simplifying things, and that their equities add up to a fixed amount, which is the amount of the prize pool. There can't be, the entire prize pool is getting paid out, and no player is different from any other. So they're all, the value that each player has must add up to the prize pool. So to write this, I used lowercase letters for the players, like player A or whatever, and without player, just capital letters for their value in the tournament. So to express this mathematically, we would say that A plus B plus C plus D, so on, all the players added up have equity equal to K, which I used this big K as the prize pool. Okay, so now we suppose player A wins some chips, maybe 50% of the chip stacks, to make it easier to imagine. Player A wins some chips from player B. Now in this case, player A has whatever, 150% of the chips. Player B has 50% of the chips, and every player in the tournament's equity changes. what you have here is that you have player C, player D, player E, etc. All these players are slightly better off. Sometimes significantly better off. It depends how many of them there are and a bunch of other factors. But they all benefit from player A winning chips from player B because now the stacks are, you know, even or close to even, whatever. The stacks are like they were before, except now there's a player who's much more short stacked, and there's a player who has a much deeper stack. And the reason that everyone benefits from this is, not everyone, but players C, D, E, the players that weren't involved in the hand, the reason they all benefit from this is that they all now have more chips than player B, and they're more likely to outlast him. And remember that in a tournament, only 15 to 25% of the prize pool goes to the player that finished first, and the remainder goes to players that actually end up with 0 chips but outlast other players. So outlasting players is as important a goal in tournaments as accumulating chips. And when a player becomes short stacked, you're more likely to outlast that player. So we know that everyone else in the tournament benefits, and of course player A benefits because he's winning the chips from player B, and player B loses. And so, of course, on the first hand of the tournament, with hundreds or even thousands of players, and the amount of chips that change hands are not a lot, even if one player gets stacked, it's still only one starting stack worth of chips, then the increase that every other player is going to have in their expectation is going to be, in their equity, is going to be extremely small, perhaps so small that it can be ignored in the situation where there are tons of players, the tournament just started, whatever. But of course, very deep in the tournament, I'm sure a lot of you have been at a final table and you've observed that you're in a better spot when one player takes a lot of chips from another player and then that other player busts a few hands later or whatever. So this is why all other players benefit from player A winning chips from player B. So when what we have here is that the value of their equities combined is going to increase. C plus D plus E plus F, whatever, is going to be a higher value than it was before. And if that increases, then the first two, A plus B, must decrease because we still have to have a fixed constant here. We still have to have A plus B plus C. All the players' equities still have to add up to the prize pool. So if all the players' equities have to add up to the prize pool, and the players that weren't involved in the hand have realized increased equity, then the players that were in the hand combined, A plus B, must overall have fewer equity. So what does it mean if player A winning chips from player B lowers their combined equity? Well, what it means is that the chips that player A won must have been worth less than the chips that player B lost. I'll just pause for a second so you can think about that. The reason that the chips player A must have won are worth less than the chips that player B lost are because A plus B must decrease, and so the value of A goes up and the value of B goes down, so the value of B has to be going down more than the value of A is going up. So we know that the chips that player B lost were we know the chips that player B lost were worth more in the absolute value, were the magnitude of his loss is greater than the magnitude of A's gain. And the reason for that is that every other player in the tournament is also making a small gain. And this makes sense because player A, although he's in a better position to outlast players, he's not in as good a shape as player B is in bad shape. And of course, remember that like I've been saying, if this is the first hand of the tournament, then you don't really care that much if one player in this big tournament wins chips from another, and if you're not involved in the hand, and so this value of C plus D of all the other players' equity that increases is going to be extremely small. So the decrease in A plus B, which goes along with this C plus D up here to make one zero sum prize pool, is going to be extremely small, and so the actual difference in value of the chips is going to be extremely small. Okay, so we have. I just wanted to make it clear in case maybe some people haven't followed that when we have the chips that player A won are worth less than the chips that player B lost. Well, player A and player B, I mean, they're both players that started out with no skill edge and the same stack. So really what we're saying is that a particular stack losing however many chips, say losing 50% of its chips, is gonna be a bigger loss than that particular stack winning 50% of its chips from another player. It doesn't. A doesn't have to win them from B. It could be any two players in the tournament. But the important thing is that when and the stacks don't have to be even either. The important thing is that when the two players play a hand, that they aren't actually playing it in isolation, that other players at the table are also going to be affected by this. And because everything has to add up to the prize pool, if those players are benefiting, in other words, if one stack is getting big and the other is getting small, then there's going to be a net loss to the players in the hand, and it's going to be what I'm talking about. It's going to be decreasing marginal value of the chips. When it happens the other way, when let's say player A was very short stacked and player B already had a lot of chips, and when the short stack doubles through the deeper stack and player A and B have more equal stacks, then it's going to be the opposite. Both of their equity is going to go up because that's going to hurt. Their combined equity is going to go up. Obviously, the player that loses, his equity is not going to go up, but their combined equity is going to go up because the remaining players, C plus D plus E, etc., their value is going to go down. So this is going to be. It might seem kind of pedantic now, but this is going to help us understand how to exploit people and what's going on the bubble and things like that later. Because what we're doing now is we're not just modeling hands by who's in the hand, but by what's going on in the entire tournament. So, okay, now that we know that chips have decreasing marginal value, now just one more last refresher. What that means is that now that we know that chips in a tournament that you lose are worth more than chips that you can add on to your stack, we want to know when is this important. Because I already gave tons of examples in the beginning of this explanation of when this is unimportant, of times when it's technically true, but the decrease is so small that it would never adjust how you're playing a hand. So now we need to know when this is important. So what we're looking for is what causes dramatically decreasing marginal value versus slightly decreasing marginal value. And so the two things that we're going to look at that can create situations where this concept is important is payout structure and current tournament field. What I mean by payout structure is how the prize money is assigned, and what I mean by current tournament field is a whole bunch of other factors. How the chip stacks are actually arranged. Are they all even? Are the chips unevenly distributed? How are people playing? Is the tournament playing quickly or and aggressively, or is it like a slower structure? Factors like that. All right. So there are three main types of tournament payout structures, which are steep payouts, flat payouts, and satellite payouts. steep payouts are similar to a cash game. I made up an example tournament, well, three example tournaments, I guess, all of which have a $10,500 prize pool. So example of a steep payout would be first place is 10,000, second place is 500. This might be like a one-seat qualifier to a tournament, or maybe like a special like invite only sit and go sort of thing, like maybe for TV. But these structures are not at all uncommon. Of course, single table satellites are the most common place that you'll find them. But basically, when you have a payout like this, the person who accumulates all the chips is taking home the vast majority of the prize pool, and whatever 95% or approximately in this case. So this is a case where it's not important, but it's not totally insignificant. It should be very similar to a cash game, how people are playing. Oops, in this situation, basically, although second place gets paid, the amount is going to be so little that, other than very close situations in three-handed play or whatever, the vast majority of the time, any play that's plus EV in terms of chips is going to be worth making, because it will give you more of the prize pool, and you basically, to make a lot of money in this tournament, need to get all the chips. Other than this special case scenario of a steep payout, every other payout, chips are going to have significantly decreasing marginal value, and you're going to have to adjust to different structures just how much they are. So I have here an example of flat payouts, and basically what flat payouts do is, unlike a cash game, they better reward you for passing on small edges. So in this example tournament, I have 4,000 for first, 3,000 for second, 2,000 for third, and 1,500 for fourth. So basically, in this tournament, the player who ends up with all the chips doesn't even win very much more than the player that outlasts almost everyone else. Basically, these sorts of final tables are becoming kind of the standard on PokerStars, and because outlasting players is so important in them, the play at final tables, or optimal play at final tables, is becoming more and more based on math and picking your spots, and less about just pushing every edge and trying to steal lots and lots of pots and put pressure on people and end up with all the chips. And the third type of payout structure that I have here is satellite payout structure. And satellite payout structure is essentially, I mean, most people have played this, they know. Satellite payout structure is essentially not regular poker anymore. My example is a tournament where first to third all pay $3,500. Like, say maybe 3 seats to a $3,500 entry tournament are awarded in this event, and no other places are paid any money at all. And what happens here is that accumulating chips never has any use whatsoever other than outlasting players. And so players are playing extremely tight in terms of never playing spots where they have a high probability of losing a lot, like even a reasonable chance of losing a lot. Basically never calling an all-in, or rarely calling an all-in. And of course, the closer you get to the payouts, the more this will be true. For example, if this tournament had 1,000 entries, on the first hand, it would play pretty much like a regular tournament, because you have to win so many chips to even get to this stage. But once you get to the end stage, even the most oblivious players are going to stop calling all-ins with like very marginal hands and gambling in marginal spots. And so as a result, even the most oblivious players are going to notice that other players are playing tighter, and they're going to start looking for spots where they can put pressure on those players, and it just becomes a game of stack sizes and looking for spots to go all in or to bluff, but not really looking for a lot of spots to call all ins. So I'll get to these payout structures probably quite a bit later in the series because they're much less intuitive. Now the other parts of the payout structure, which I didn't list in as much detail, of course, are how much of the field pays, and especially important, I mean, of course, all the payouts matter, but especially important is how much a tournament pays for the minimum cash. The percentage of the field that a tournament pays has gone up significantly in the last couple of years for online tournaments. It used to be 9 to 10% was the standard amount of the field that would finish in the money. Now it's getting to be 15, 16, even as high as 20% in a lot of tournaments. Now, obviously, the more percentage of the field that's getting paid out, the less of the prize pool is going to first place. The more the prize pool is going to other places, the more value there's going to be in outlasting other players. It's gotten to be so dramatic that I've noticed a lot of tournaments on PokerStars, for example, are getting more players than they used to, or the same amount of players that they used to, and having a larger prize pool or an equal sized prize pool, but they're paying significantly less money for first. So of course that's something that you have to make an adjustment for. And the other specific, I mean, of course all the payouts matter, but the other major one is how much for the absolute minimum cash. The bubble from the minimum cash to finishing out the money is a really important bubble, partly because often the increment from out of the money to in the money is between 1 to 2 buy-ins, and then the increments of payouts after that are going to be pretty small. So the size of that particular increment, whether it's 1 buy-in or 2 buy-ins, for example, can also make a big difference. And I'll get to that more in my bubble section, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about like how all these different aspects of payout structure can affect things, and basically the overall principle for all of them is how much of the prize pool is paid out to people that outlast everyone and win. How much is it paid out to people that outlast a lot of players? To get second or third, like you're still going to have to accumulate a lot of chips, versus how much of the prize pool is paid out to the players that, in extreme cases might finish, 1,000th place or something in the Stars Million, and they're still getting paid. And so, of course, 1,000 players, if they get, 1 buy-in versus 1.5 buy-ins back for their cash, that's going to make a big difference for how the overall prize pool is distributed. The other factor that can determine the extent to which chips behave more like a cash game or more like tournament scenarios where they have diminishing marginal value is the tournament field itself. The first thing I wanted to talk about here was extremely short stacks can cause other at-risk stacks to have highly diminishing marginal value. Basically what this means is when there's a guy with a couple big blinds around and you're kind of short stacked, this is a situation where you should play very tightly, because the chips that you can add onto your short stack aren't going to be worth anywhere near as much as outlasting this extremely short stack and moving up another payout. A lot of people make mistakes with regards to this, or don't pay close enough attention to this. Sometimes, for example, at a final table, you'll have a situation where people have been playing really tight on the bubble to that final table, and there might be like 2 stacks that have like 5 or 6 big blinds at the final table, and you'll see some of the larger stacks kind of get into some conflicts, and you'll see a guy like 4-bet bluff or 5-bet bluff or whatever, and like get his stack in like a really marginal spot, and obviously that's a much bigger mistake when there are these 5 to 6 big blind stacks around than when everyone has equal stacks, because when everyone has equal stacks, if the player that kind of spewed with his 5-bet or whatever hadn't done that, then he would have had probably an equal chance to anyone else of busting on just coolers or regular hands. But with extremely short stacks, if he hadn't played such a marginal spot, then he would be almost assured moving up a couple spots in the payout. And of course, marginal spots in poker abound. You can, if you're looking for a spot to 3-bet, 5-bet a guy, and you think he's the type of player where you can do that easily and whatever, you can wait until a couple of the real short stacks bust pretty easily and avoid those spots. And so, analogous to extremely short stacks is extremely big stacks. If a single player or a small number of players have a very high fraction of the chips in play, it also greatly reduces the marginal value of chips. The reason for this is much simpler. The reason for this is just that it's very hard to get first place when someone has a giant stack. When you're at a final table and say first place has 30% of the chips and second place has 28% of the chips or something, and then there's 7 other players, like, it's very unlikely that any of those players are going to get first or second, and they're going to do a lot better, especially if the blinds are high. They're going to do a lot better just trying to outlast each other and get that pretty good payout for third, and possibly even hope that the 2 big stacks get all in against each other, and that you have a chance at lasting all the way into second. And there's all sorts of things about tournament field, but another big example is how, like, a fast structure, like rapidly increasing blinds or very aggressive players, are things that can be similar to having a short stacks player, and that they make it so that all you have to do is wait a couple of hands and the situation will get better for you. Someone will bust, either because the blinds will go up several times, especially if the blinds are going to go up on someone else's big blind in very poor structures, or because players in the tournament, you can open up other tables and get a sense for this. If players in your tournament are just playing extremely aggressively and getting it in light, it's effectively the same as if they had very short stacks. So these mimic the effect of having a short stacked player, and so you can see how they would also cause your chips. It's very important to not lose chips in these situations because you're trying to outlast people, and it's not so important to accumulate chips because you don't get as much value from winning as much as from outlasting players. I didn't really even make too many notes about this, but another important generalization you can make from this is that when the opposite of these concepts, when the opposite of these situations occur, you should make the opposite adjustment. When you have a slow structure and you have, like, not too aggressive players, like, people are kind of picking their spots a little more carefully, and especially when the stacks are all very even, this is your opportunity to go ahead and try and win some chips for yourself, because this is a situation where the chips don't have in extremely diminishing marginal utility, and here you can really look for plus EV spots, and I guess that goes without saying, but just always be aware not only of reasons why you should tighten up, but also reasons why you should loosen up and stop playing this sort of game plan. So I kind of wanted to wrap up this section by talking about how some of these concepts might be misapplied, or how you should be careful with some of these concepts. So what I have here is diminishing does not mean negative. Basically what I'm saying is that although you have frequent spots in tournaments where adding on to your stack isn't as important as protecting the chips in it and not losing them, but that doesn't mean that adding on to your stack is negative or bad or minus EV. You still want to play regular poker most of the time. So what I wrote is most of the hands in your range are very plus CV. That's why they're in your range. It doesn't matter, for example, if getting stacked with aces is much worse than doubling up with aces in a tournament, because you almost never get stacked with aces all in pre-flop compared to how often you double up with them. And not just aces, of course. Like any most of the things that you do in poker, you're doing because it's very profitable. Even if it's a bluff, like, or a semi bluff or something like that. Like if you're winning a lot of chips from it, and your opponent is making like a big mistake that you're exploiting, then you want to go ahead and keep doing it. These concepts are more to guide you in like very close situations, in smaller pots, what hands to open when you're on a very short stack, things like that. These aren't necessarily rules to fold a ton of hands. In fact, I usually only make big adjustments near the money bubble or at the final table, and so I'm gonna make sure to specifically talk about both of those. But other than that, a lot of times you're in the money, and the payouts of a tournament will increase by some ridiculously small fraction. You might get $180 for finishing in the money, but then like 9 spots or whatever, 36 spots later, the next payout that goes up might be $189. It's not something that's really even worth worrying about. So you want to save your big adjustments for when you're near the money bubble and at the final table. And so the most important part of this of all, I would say, is that we're talking about playing tight, but we're not talking about making big hero folds in big pots. A hero fold is a situation where, against the range that you would normally be up against, your hand is a big favorite, but because of some other information that you have, your hand is instead not a big favorite, and in fact is beat or whatever, and you know to fold. Like if you have kings, but like a really tight player is giving you a tell that he has aces and whatever. You don't want to look for spots to like 4-bet and then fold to the 5-bet with pocket queens or something, just because it's some kind of money bubble, or because you don't want to risk your case chips. You want to possibly take lines like flat calling rather than 3-betting with hands, like marginal hands, to keep the pot small in the first place. You want to avoid marginal situations, but you absolutely don't want to start making big laydowns or like big adjustments that end up costing you expected value. Because of course, if you're really spewing a lot of EV and making a lot of bad folds, or not playing the most profitable hands that got you to where you are in poker, then of course you're not going to be outlasting players either, because they're going to be making more plus EV plays than you, and accumulating more chips. So look for small edges and small spots where you can kind of cheat and play fewer hands than you normally would, but don't look for spots to throw away everything. And there are a few exceptions to this, and especially in the money bubble situation, but I'll cover those later. Alright, I think that's it for part 1 of this series. I'd really like to have more feedback than I've been getting recently on the forums, either in the tournament forum or on the little messages underneath the video. I'm going to try and talk about the money bubble next time specifically, and how I play all different stack sizes near and on the money bubble, and how different money bubbles play out. And then maybe after that I'll talk about final table. But I really want to devote a lot to the money bubble, because I think that's the area where people are making the biggest mistakes. I'm going to try and keep everything as like simple, and try to avoid numbers as much as I can, just like in this video. but I will try to show some specific hands and some more specific and less general concepts in the next video. I hope you guys like this. Thanks for watching.